First off, we're starting with our supplies. So here I have some thread. Thread is really important when it comes to sewing. Really, without thread, you can't sew. Usually you'll be using thread whether you're doing sewing with a machine or with your hands and a needle. Next up, we have scissors. Scissors, this is pretty self-explanatory. You'll need scissors for cutting your fabric, and it's important to have a specific pair of scissors for cutting your fabric. Next up, we have a bobbin, and I have this special magnetic bobbin holder. Bobbins can come in plastic or metal forms, and this is one of the metal forms. Next up, we have our safety pins. This can be used sometimes to just pin fabric together and hold it together for short periods of time. Here we have a seam ripper, and seam rippers are used to rip up seams and to take apart fabric. Though there are many methods to rip a seam, I find this method to be the easiest. Next up, we have tailor's chalk. This can be used to make markings on your wrong side of the fabric, and we'll be going over fabric later, but these can come in all sorts of shapes and forms. Next up, we have fabric markers. These are another tool that you can use to mark up your fabric when you are in the process of measuring and getting ready to cut your fabric. You may have heard of the phrase measure twice, cut once. This helps you to get very precise markings. Next up, we have elastic. This is used in certain projects, and really you can just use it to your liking depending on your project. It can come in different sizes, different widths, different colors, so pick what will be right for you and right for your project. Next up, we have zippers. Once again, it depends on the project, depends on what you're trying to do. Zippers come in many colors, many lengths. They come in different forms. There are regular zippers, there are special zippers for jackets, there are invisible zippers. Next up, we have velcro. This is one form of fastening as well, and many of you have seen velcro in doll clothing. This is one example. Next up, we have buttons. Buttons are typically, I believe they're sewn on by hand, so you might need a couple of hand sewing skills if you want to attach buttons. Next up, we have hook and eye fasteners, another thing that requires hand sewing because they are quite small, but basically the idea is you have a little hook and it goes through the eye just like that. Next up, we have sew on snaps. This is basically what the name suggests. You basically sew it on and the two have snapped together to close your garment or your project. Our next and final item are pins and a pin cushion. This isn't necessarily required, but it's basically the preferred choice for holding fabric together while you are running it through a sewing machine, and having a pin cushion is very helpful because that's where you're going to store your pins without pricking yourself or hurting yourself in the process of holding your fabric together. In sewing, there are multiple ways in which you can measure your fabric and various other things. One thing is a ruler. So I have 3 rulers here, a 12-inch, a 24-inch, and a 24 by 6-inch straight ruler. Those can be helpful for when you're trying to measure on fabric. Next up, we have a measuring tape. This is really helpful if you start trying to measure yourself because it is flexible. These can come in different colors and lengths. I typically use a 60-inch, but this one has a 120-inch length. Next up, we have one of the most important tools for sewing, and this is something that you're gonna need basically in every project you have, and that is fabric. So we have many different kinds of fabric that we can use, and I'm gonna go over 3 main types. The first is denim. Denim is something that many of us have come across in our everyday life, typically known in jeans and denim jackets. Denim can come in different thicknesses. Some of them are a little stretchier than others, so just pick what's right for you. Next up, we have cotton and print fabrics. These come in a variety of different patterns, different stretchiness levels, different colors. They can be solid or printed. And this now brings me to the topic of right side versus wrong side. It's very important that you notice, especially in patterned clothing, whether something has a right or wrong side. Typically the wrong side will be a little more faded than the right side, as we can see with this flower and this polka dotted pattern. Now we're moving on to the fun stuff, and these are organza, tulle, mesh, and sheer fabrics. These come in a huge variety, and they range from these shinier, silkier fabrics to these almost net-like mesh fabrics. You can have a lot of fun with these. You can make like tutus, and you can make really cool dresses and really cool projects using these. This one is a beaded kind of fabric, and they're just really fun to use. So before moving on to the practice round, in which we practice some basic stitches with the sewing machine, it's important that we cut out some fabric. So I cut out one long rectangle of the blue fabric, and then I'm using my tailor's chalk to mark out a straight line using the ruler on the polka dotted fabric. When you do make these markings, make sure that you make markings on the wrong side of the fabric, because that is the side that people are not going to be seeing once the project is finished. I then finish it off by cutting it into two smaller rectangles so we can practice fabric joining later. One thing that is optional but very recommended is for you guys to iron flat your fabric. And I think that it's something that's, of course, by preference, but it's really helpful to have just flat ironed out fabric, because it makes the sewing process a lot easier and you're less likely to be sewing over folds and have a messier project. Once I ironed out the fabric, I folded my long blue rectangle in half and used my tailor's chalk once again to make small marks and draw lines that were about ½ an inch apart. And for one of those, I just left it blank with no line. So I used my pins to hold the fabric together, and with each new line, I used fewer and fewer pins, and for one of them, I used no pins at all. So next up, we'll be threading our machine and winding our bobbin. So first up, you need to turn on your machine and remove your bobbin, which is typically located near the presser foot. For reference, I will be using the Brother GX37 lightweight sewing machine, and I did do a video on that, so check it out after this one. So there are two ways in which one can wind up a bobbin, and there are also two forms of bobbins, a plastic and a metal. I'll be showing you guys both methods for winding a bobbin, but it's important to note that you should be putting your bobbin in the little bobbin spool and your thread in the thread spool, and also make note of the different markings that are on your machine telling you which way to pull your thread so you can wind your bobbin correctly. With winding method number 1, you can just take your thread and put it through this little hole located at the top or the bottom of the bobbin and just wind it around. While with method 2, you can just wrap it all the way around multiple times until it is tight. All you need to do then is basically push in your bobbin, because that is a really important part. Make sure you push it in so that when you start the machine, it winds the bobbin, and instead it's not going to be making the needle go instead. Then all you have to do is make sure that your thread is going in a straight line and it's winding properly, and you can just watch your bobbin be loaded up with thread. So most machines have little instructions that show you how to properly wind up the bobbin, but I'm also going to be showing you guys by hand how you can wind it up. So basically what you need to do is remove the plate that's covering the bobbin, and this is a very important part, that when you pull out your thread, make sure that your bobbin is making sort of a P shape, with the thread coming out being the line of the P. Then you can drop in your bobbin into its spot, and all you need to do now is pull your bobbin underneath the little spot so that your bobbin thread is caught in there, and then all you need to do is cut it off. Once in, you just need to cover your bobbin with the plate. Now we need to thread the upper half of the machine. So after putting the thread spool on the spool holder, just follow the instructions and the little arrow markings that your machine has. So once I got to number 5, I had to use the side hand wheel so that I could properly get my thread in and looped through. Every machine is different, so it's just important that you follow the instructions that your machine gives you. Most of the machines, though, follow a similar process, all ending with you threading your thread through the eye of the needle and pulling it out from underneath the presser foot. One method I use for bringing the bobbin thread out from underneath is lowering the presser foot, lowering the needle a couple of times, and from there it'll catch onto the bobbin thread, and I use scissors to help me pull out the bobbin thread itself. To set our machine to a straight stitch, I'm locating the number of the stitch and then turning the dial to match that number. Be sure to also familiarize yourself with other dials on your machine that help to control settings such as stitch width, such as this first one. So with changing the dial, that also changes the width of each individual stitch being made by the needle. This next one controls 2 different settings: the positioning of our needle, whether it is aligned to the left, the right, or the center. I typically keep mine on the center. And it also controls the width of a zigzag stitch. Usually this one I don't really mess with because my preferred choice is to keep the needle in the center. The only time I change it is usually for zigzag stitches. So with our next dial, it basically controls our tightness of the thread at the top of the machine. This is something I never really mess with. Also helpful is locating certain locations on your sewing machine, such as the reverse button or lever, and also the lever that controls the presser foot, letting it go up and down as you wish. This is helpful for releasing your fabric, and some machines even have a little blade on the side that helps you cut the thread off. Starting off with our basic straight stitch, all we need to do is take our fabric with the marked lines and align that line with the center of your presser foot. Then lower your presser foot and your needle into the fabric, sew down just about ½ inch or so, and then hold down on your reverse button or lever so you can sew in the opposite direction, and then continue to sew all the way down your fabric. Be sure to remove pins before you run your needle over it, because that might run the risk of you breaking the needle itself. When you get to the end, repeat that same thing, going back and forth using your reverse button, and this helps to lock in the stitches so they don't unravel. Continue this practice of sewing a straight line with the remaining first half of the lines that were drawn on the fabric, and hopefully by the time you get to that final line in the first half, you should hopefully be confident enough to attempt sewing a straight line without use of a drawn out line. This can be daunting at first, but with a lot of practice, soon you'll be able to get the hang of it and draw straight lines with full confidence. To select a zigzag stitch, all I'm doing is doing the same thing and locating the number of the stitch and setting my machine to that number. Now all you need to do is make sure that your line is centered on the presser foot, and from there you just need to do a quick forward and back locking stitch before going all the way down that line. Make sure again that the line is centered with your presser foot so that your zigzag stitch is as centered as possible on that line. Now that we're done, this is basically the final product of our basic stitch practice. We practiced with a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. These two stitches are two of the most important ones that you will need to know while sewing. With time, you can experiment with all sorts of other kinds as well. Moving on to the topic of fabric joining, we're going to bring back those two little rectangles of polka dotted fabric and make sure that you lay them on top of each other, right side to right side. Now with the wrong sides facing outward, we're going to pin them down about, I'd say, 1/4 of an inch in, and then we're going to sew a straight line using our sewing machine. Just remember to remove pins as you go along. Once finished with that straight line, we are going to go back to the ironing board and we're going to iron out that little area right there, and we're gonna flatten it with our iron. Then once we finish that, we're going to iron it again right there on the seam just to make sure that it's neat. And then we're going to head off to the sewing machine once more and we're going to do a final touch, a rolling hem. There are multiple ways in which you can hem the edge of a garment or a project. One of these ways I'm already showing you with this one piece of doll clothing, in which I only ran a zigzag stitch on the very end of the fabric and just folded it over one time and used a straight stitch to fold that. However, I'm going to show you guys a bit of a cleaner way to do it, which is a simple rolling hem. All we need to do is fold our fabric over twice and pin it in place. Then all we need to do after that is take it back to the sewing machine where we will run a final straight stitch all the way down. Make sure to keep it to the edge of the fold so that the excess fabric that was tucked underneath doesn't come all the way back out again. Once you reach the end, don't forget to lock in your stitches using a reverse straight stitch. And just like that, you are done. You just hemmed a little piece of fabric. Hopefully this video helped some of you guys out, especially those of you who are looking to get into sewing using a sewing machine. Hopefully this answered any questions that you guys had regarding the basics of sewing and understanding the bare minimum of using stitches. Don't forget to drop a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see all of you in my next video.